Howdy folks, and welcome to Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, where we have some extremely good news and some moderately bad and situational, well, bad news. Most of which you're probably aware of if you watched yesterday's extremely short video, where I attempted to do today's video, but yesterday, and it didn't work out. The short version of my trials and tribulations is as follows. Logged into Steam, downloaded the new launcher, which was around about 350 megabytes and took around about 2 minutes on my 200 megabit internet connection. Fired up the launcher, was greeted with a message saying that there was a further 23 gigabytes to download, which was of course a massive barefaced lie, as the installation progress bar at the bottom of the screen quite clearly showed that I was downloading a massive 40 gigabytes of compressed data at extremely slow speeds, probably due to the fact that Microsoft decided to release this massive update for PC and fresh installation for Xbox at exactly the same time worldwide. So, well, basically the entire world were hammering Microsoft's servers at the same time, which meant that my download dropped as low as 0.14 megabits per second and never went above 5 or 6 megabits per second, which meant that this entire download process took 8.5 hours. Hang on a minute, Jingles, isn't it around about the time of the year when your ISP inflicts your annual shitty internet connection shenanigans upon you? Yes, it is, but that hasn't really happened this year. And in any case, this would not be the first time that I'd suffered horrendously slow downloads while messing around with Microsoft Flight Sim. The original installation back in Christmas of last year, I also had to leave overnight, and that's what I did this time around as well. So I arose bright and early on Wednesday morning to the happy news that the 40 gigabyte download was complete. So imagine my horror at 7:30 AM on Wednesday morning when, thinking that I was finally done, I logged into the game, opened up the content manager and discovered that there was a further 20 gigabytes of data that needed to be downloaded and installed, because every time Microsoft Flight Sim posts an update, you also have to update all of the previous updates and all of the content and bundles that you own, all of the third-party content, all of the free content also has to be updated. However, this time I was getting in excess of 200 megabit downloads. Don't know why, but I'm not complaining. This whole process only took about 10 minutes. But that is about it as far as bad news is concerned, where the July update for Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 is concerned. Well, not quite. There was still a little bit of bad news for me. You see, prior to downloading and eventually installing the update, I had installed a little piece of software called FPS Monitor. You can see it running in the top left corner of the screen right now, in order to provide a sort of before and after screenshot of the kind of performance gains that I could expect from the July update for MSFS 2020. So I jumped into a flight over Manhattan because it's particularly demanding on your hardware, and in the pre-update version of MSFS, managed to record frame rates varying between 50 and 20 frames per second. And then post-update did exactly the same thing, and it crashed. And when I say it crashed, I don't mean I crashed. I don't mean I did a Jingles landing into the side of the Empire State Building. I mean the simulation crashed. So I restarted it, tried again, and it crashed again. And it crashed again. However, I was able to determine that this wasn't strictly speaking the fault of Microsoft Flight Sim. When I tried running the simulation without the performance monitor overlay, it functioned flawlessly. Better than flawlessly. Now, while this does unfortunately mean I cannot show you direct before and after performance monitor statistics, well, look at the evidence of your own eyes. This is running at 4K resolution. It's not being downscaled. Everything is turned up to ultra, or in some cases high, but mostly ultra. And whereas over this central part of Midtown Manhattan, around Central Park, previously, before the update, I was going as low as 20 frames per second, after the update, I never dropped below 55 and was at least 60 for probably about 80% of the time. This is a better than 100% performance increase. Although you're probably not going to see that kind of performance increase unless you have high-end hardware. Although I have seen from browsing various different threads on, for example, Reddit and elsewhere, that people with lower end hardware, and I'm talking GTX1070 graphics cards here, are still seeing a 10 to 15% performance uplift across the board. And that is not insignificant. But it's not all about the raw performance gains, although I'm pretty sure that that's what most people are going to be ecstatic about. Although we're going to circle back to the issue of the performance gains later on in the video because, well, I wouldn't be me if I hadn't found something to be pissed off about. but it's not all about the performance gains. Because while they are substantial, there's also a whole bunch of actual content been added, like this flight assistant, for example. You can select from a list of all kinds of landmarks, cities, airports, points of interest, all manner of good stuff, of which there is no shortage in Manhattan Island in particular, and instruct your pilot assistant to take you there. And then you can just sit back and admire the view. You don't have to, of course. You can simply limit the flight assistant to point out the direction towards whichever landmark, point of interest, airport, or whatever has taken your fancy and then fly yourself there. But if you're feeling particularly lazy, you can just let the autopilot take over, which is what I'm doing here, so I can get some particularly pretty screenshots. Flying past the Empire State Building there, a couple of blocks south from which we should be able to find the Flatiron Building. For those of you who have no idea what the Flatiron Building is, you're probably more familiar with it as the Continental Hotel from the John Wick movies. And it's going to be around here somewhere. And oh, yep, there it is. It's actually got an icon over the top of it, which I hadn't noticed until now. There it is. That's the Flatiron Building. You can probably see how it got its name. One thing about this flight assistant, or more specifically the AI pilot incorporated with the flight assistant, which remember you don't have to use unless you want to. I wanted to know how well it was going to handle obstacles. Because, well, if you're flying below a certain altitude in Manhattan, there are plenty of obstacles. We call them skyscrapers. So, bearing this in mind, I thought I'd set it a little test. Using the Flight Assistant drop-down menu, I said, "My good sir, take me to the Statue of Liberty, and be snappy about it." And while the AI co-pilot wasn't being particularly snappy about it, because I am flying a Cessna 172, and the Cessna 172 doesn't do anything snappily, it did bring me around and head me in the direction of the Statue of Liberty. But between me and the Statue of Liberty, especially at this altitude, there are several problems. So the question is, does the AI pilot have the good sense to not do something while I'm recording that, if it were to go up on YouTube, would probably result in my channel being shut down by millions of angry and outraged, and rightfully so, Americans? And I'm pretty sure he's not actually trying to avoid anything, and that was more luck than judgment. So my advice to you would be to not completely trust the AI pilot when you're on one of these sightseeing trips, because he makes no effort whatsoever to avoid any obstacles in your path. Be absolutely fine once you're above a certain altitude and there are no obvious navigational hazards, so, you know, not around the Himalayas or anything, but otherwise, by all means take advantage of the flight assist provided by the AI co-pilot, but don't rely on it. In other news, as well as completely revamping the flight training system with a whole host of added tutorial lessons in order to get you up and hopefully down again, without killing yourself in the process, they've also, well, they're calling this the Land Anywhere experience. There's always been bush aircraft in the game, particularly suited for extremely rough and short bush landing strips. And there was, of course, also the Icon A5, which was an amphibious aircraft which was capable of landing and taking off from the water, but they've expanded the selection with a Floatplane Cessna and other aircraft that are equipped with skids. Oh, just down there below the Brooklyn Bridge, Giuliani's Pizza. Best pizza in New York. Sorry, got sidetracked. Yes, other aircraft equipped with skids, allowing you to land in snow. So while you still can't quite land anywhere, the range of options available to you has been drastically increased. Which is why I ended up doing an extremely bumpy but thankfully non-fatal water landing here in the muddy waters of Lake Chad in Central Africa. Stop bouncing. There we go, we're down. Give it some rudder. Need to turn this thing around. And the reason why I need to turn this thing around is because I've come to Lake Chad to see something. It's not simply because I'm going to require an awful lot of open water to execute a takeoff. And by the way, you do require an awful lot of open water to execute a takeoff because these floats are useful, but they create an awful lot of drag. Now there's something over there on the shores of Lake Chad that I came down here to see. Thankfully, the Cessna 172 floatplane is equipped with rudders, not just the rudder on the tail of the plane, but you can't quite see them here because they're underwater where a water rudder should be. It also has a couple of rudders in the rear of the floats. The floats, by the way, have extending landing gear, allowing you to land on a hard surface as well as on water. And after a short but swift cruise through the turbulent waters of Lake Chad, we arrive at our destination. A herd of hippopotamuses. Akazuki, what do you call... What's the plural of hippopotamus, Akazuki? Is it hippopotami? Hippopotamuses? A herd of hippos. Thankfully, not hungry hippos. These buggers are lethal, by the way. More people die in hippopotamus attacks every year than the combined sum total of people who die to bears and sharks. Stay away from these big bad-tempered buggers. Admittedly, that shouldn't be too much of a problem for most people watching this video, but just on the off chance that you do happen to live on the shores of Lake Chad, stay away from the hippos. Oh, yeah, hippos. No thank you. They're not the only wildlife that you can enjoy in Microsoft Flight Sim, although it doesn't have a huge range of fauna. And I do wish they'd add some more. I mean, I personally would love to be able to fly low over a herd of wildebeest on the African savannah, but I'll take what we can get. And what we can get, so far at least, is limited to hippos, flocks of flamingos, grizzly bears, elephants, and giraffes. And here are some we prepared earlier. They're not known for being particularly aggressive, but I've watched David Attenborough, and let me tell you, I would not want to come between two bull giraffes and a female during the mating season. Those buggers can get aggressive. Have you ever seen two giraffes having a fight? Those necks and the horns on top of the head are surprisingly dangerous weapons. But anyway, what else is new? A surprisingly large amount, actually. I mean, I've covered most of the major points, but the one major point that I haven't covered are the improvements to the world map. The world map was, at best, functional. I mean, it did what it needed to do, but it wasn't terribly detailed. Well, now it is. Very, very detailed. Not quite up to the standard of Google Maps, but not that far off either. Let's take a close look at some place I actually know. Portsmouth and Gosport. I can't remember how long I've lived here. Since the mid-90s at least. So, Portsmouth on the east side, Gosport on the west side. It's a bit like San Francisco and Oakland, except not nearly as expensive. And, yep, there's the Spinnaker Tower, over by Gunwharf Quays. Gosport Marina, Gosport High Street. Let's just see. We follow the High Street along here. Eventually we'll come to a roundabout right there in the middle of the map. And up to the north, that big-ass complex here, and extending all the way right up to there, is HMS Sultan. That's the Royal Naval School of Electrical, Mechanical and Aeronautical Engineering. Over here we have the artist formerly known as HMS Daedalus, or Naval Air Station Gosport, which was sold off to the highest bidder several years ago, because that's just what the government does. Up at the other end of the Solent Estuary, where is it? We have Portchester Castle. Oh, there it is. Right there. Developed by the Saxons and later the Normans on the ruins of a Roman fortification, and not Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I hope you're paying attention, not located there. Further to the north, we have the Palmerston's Follies on the hill overlooking Portsdown, a series of forts built by the Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston during the Napoleonic Wars. A series of forts built at massive expense in order to contain any French invasion of Portsmouth and prevent them from being able to fight their way inland. Over here, Fort Nelson, home of the Royal Armouries Artillery Museum. Three other forts, only two of which I can remember the names of. Fort Widley, further to the west, Fort Purbrook, and then another one whose name I can't remember. Also, just a couple of miles north of Portsdown Hill, you'll find Southwark House, which was General Eisenhower's headquarters during the planning and execution phases of D-Day. And then, of course, further down to the south, actually in the mouth of the Solent estuary, you have these ring forts, although only one visible on the map because the detail on the map only extends so far off the coast. Again, hideously expensive. There's Southsea Castle, Southsea Common, I believe that's the Cenotaph and War Memorial there. Yeah, these maps are amazingly well detailed, and they're this detailed everywhere. So, yeah, this is a massively successful update for Microsoft Flight Sim 2020. Whole bunch of new features, huge performance gains. I mean, just ridiculously impressive performance gains. We're not talking about something like the Odyssey expansion for Elite Dangerous that actually seemed to put the pace of development back a couple of years, where everything was worse after the update than before. This update is, without question, a massive, huge, colossal step forward for Microsoft Flight Sim. Not just all of the new features, but the massive performance gains that you will enjoy once you've downloaded and installed this new update. And yet at the same time, I cannot help but think, because remember I did say that we were going to circle back to the issue of the performance gains, because I smell a rat. Not that I think the performance gains are a bad thing, they're not. They're great. I mean, remember, I'm experiencing, in areas of particularly complex and dense geometry, I'm experiencing better than 100% performance gains. And even if you're running on relatively modest hardware, like for example a GTX 1070 graphics card at 1080p resolution, you can still expect at least 10 to 15% performance increase. And that's actually a problem for me. I don't want to bite the hand that feeds me here, but generally speaking, when a software developer pushes out an update in which they promise optimizations that are going to lead to performance gains, you're usually talking about something in the region of 5 to 10, maybe 15%. There is, after all, a limit to how much performance increase you can squeeze out of simply optimizing existing code. When I see an update that gives me a better than 100% performance increase, that's not optimization. That's rewriting everything from scratch. Now, call me a wizened old cynic here if you must, but I cannot help but feel more than slightly suspicious that this massive optimization comes at exactly the same time as the console release on Xbox of Microsoft Flight Sim 2020. It's almost as if the PC release of MSFS in August of last year, nearly a year ago, was in fact just the beta version of the game. Rushed out of the door in time for Christmas, but in a playable state, although with horribly limited frame rates, while Microsoft and Asobo Studios busied themselves over the course of the next 11 months getting version 1.0 of the game ready for simultaneous release on both PC and console. Let's face it, it wouldn't be the first time a developer had done this, would it, Frontier Developments and Elite Odyssey? Now, I'm fully prepared to admit that I may be wrong. I have nothing but circumstantial evidence to go on, after all, but it does look awfully suspicious. 120% performance gains is not optimization. That's a rewrite, and I find it awfully suspicious that this rewrite just so happens to coincide with the console release of the same game. Oh, the humanity. The glorious PC master race, reduced to beta testing for the console peasants. And yet, even if this is true, and I don't know for sure that it is, I mean I suspect it is, but I don't know. But even if it is, I can't really bring myself to care that much. Because I've gotten a 120% performance increase. I'm getting 60 frames per second at 4K resolution on ultra settings everywhere. Yeah, I'll take it. So, well, taking my tinfoil hat off for a moment, I can't really say anything but good things about this July update, coinciding with the console release for Microsoft Flight Sim 2020. And even with my tinfoil hat on, I don't care. It's because it is all good. So, if you are an existing owner of Microsoft Flight Sim, it's all good news. If you're not an existing owner of Microsoft Flight Sim and you were getting put off by the horrific frame rates and the fact that there was basically no difference on a high-end PC between running things on low detail and ultra detail, you were still basically limited to 30 frames per second at best and 25 frames per second or below in particularly congested areas, well, not anymore. Now would be the time to get it. The game is basically as it should have been on launch, and probably would have been on launch if they'd been honest and just delayed it 11 months and pushed it out at the same time as the Xbox version. But hey, it is what it is. And what it is pretty damn good. That's it for today, folks. I hope you've enjoyed it. And as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.